In the grim darkness of the far future, amidst the ravaged battlefields and forgotten corners of the universe, whispers of unspeakable horrors echo through the void. Welcome, brave souls, to a realm where fear reigns supreme, and the line between sanity and madness is but a fragile thread. Welcome to the twisted tales of Warhammer Horror. Imperator Gladio. Richard Strachan. The night had been cold, and the smell of the salt marshes was still dormant as the twin suns rose, one casting a pale corona to wreathe the first with fire. In the distance came the sound of a desultory cannonade from the basilisk batteries, and from the other side of the motor pool, the battered tank platoons were turning over their engines, preparing the retreat. Captain Becherovka stowed the data slate in the thigh pocket of his fatigues as he cut through churned and oily mud. Dread was coiled deep in his stomach. It was an old friend now, much missed when it wasn't there. He held out a trembling hand and gripped it with the other. Then, as he skirted a line of chimeras, out of the mist it loomed, monolithic, the salt marshes fanning away behind it. Like an outcrop of rock, he thought, or stacked basalt slabs cooling on a volcanic plain. The camouflage paint had flecked away to reveal the brooding black metal underneath. He held his breath as he approached it, reverent, afraid. Imperator Gladio. It was as if he were approaching a temple, a primitive homage to some appalling, vengeful god. The main gun stretched out like a brandished sword, the squat muzzle of the demolisher cannon beneath it, glazed with afterburn. The bane blade bristled with secondary weapons, less cannons, heavy bolters, heavy flamers, heavy stubbers. Nothing about it was light, or geared for anything other than total destruction. It was the most powerful weapon available to the Zentrale 77th Armored Dragoons, but as Becherovka came near, he felt only the wild stirrings of that dread in his stomach, the sense of fate lying heavily against him. The Gladio. There wasn't a super-heavy crewman in the regiment who didn't fear that name. "We need to be certain that you're up to the job," Colonel Radetzky had said to him the night before. "What he means," the Lord Commissar had drawled, "is, will you break? The nightmares, the trauma. Can we rely on you, Captain?" The command tent had been musty and close, the lights dark from the lumen globe that stuttered above the map table. Much revised, the map showed a front on the verge of collapse, troops' positions overrun by suicidal cultist assaults, counter-attacking armored spearheads, shattered against impregnable defenses. The archenemy was rolling up the advance everywhere. The whole campaign was on the brink. "Yes," he'd said, with as much certainty as he could muster. "A recon team found it 4 days ago," Radetzky said. "It was recovered last night, refitted, rearmed. It's in good working order, as far as we can tell. Throne knows we need every advantage we can get. The mission schematics will be cast to your slate," the Commissar informed him. "Relieve, reinforce, resist. No retreat." "I know the drill," Becherovka said, and inside he thought, suicide mission, and the Gladio of all things. Well, it was going to come at some point. It may as well be now when all else seems lost. A strange recklessness gripped him, and he said, "The Gladio, a cursed tank for a cursed man." 6 times the Baneblade had been dispatched in the campaign to pacify the Valgast front. Each time it had returned with new rumors and legends accruing to it, like barnacles to a ship's hull. Some said the first honored lieutenant to lead it into combat had died in the command chair from an unexplained seizure. It was only when the mission was complete that the rest of the crew realized he had been dead for hours, even though he'd been speaking to them over the Vox the whole time. Supposedly, a reactor leak had killed the crew with rad poisoning on its third mission, and there was a rumor that during one expedition, the Gladio's machine spirit had turned on a supporting Lehman Russ platoon and wiped them out, the gunners powerless to stop it. It was a cursed tank indeed. Superstitious nonsense, Radetzky told him. We've had men shot for less. The only curse is our dearth of reliable parts for repairs. Be careful, Captain, the Commissar hissed. You tread on dangerous ground here. Becherovka strapped on his helmet and saluted. Hadn't you heard, Lord Commissar? I'm an expert in dangerous ground. He was aware of the figure he must cut as he approached the crew, diminished, faded, about a stone underweight, and with a nervous tick in his eye. Lieutenant Kovar, the second in command and primary gunner, looked up and nodded. Stein, the driver, her face permanently marked by the black frames of her goggles, gave a lazy salute. Come to join us then, Captain, she said. The voyage of the damned. They all felt it, this accursed place, clawing at their minds, the endless wilds of marshland and dead mists and desolate fog. They tried to hide it with a soldier's gallows humor, but they hated this front as much as he did. They were a scratch team, about 4 short of what the Baneblade demanded. They lounged just outside its shadow, some playing knucklebones, others chaining low sticks, and arguing the finer points of bootleg Amasek styles. Kovar and Stein he knew already. The engineer, Polivo, came recommended. The others were unknown to him, but the data slate had given him their names. Zaj and Musil, wiry twins who would man the sponsons. Jezek, built like an ogrin and pulling double duty to load and fire the demolisher. Becherovka himself would man the autocannon and the heavy stubber. It was a mess. It was worse than a mess. But it was what they had. And every one of them would know him by reputation. Captain Haladar Becherovka, who'd spent 4 days at the bottom of the salt marshes, breathing a pocket of stale air, while his Storm Sword's crew drowned in the mud around him. Under his breath, he muttered the first words of the dragoon's battle prayer. Facta non verba. Deeds, not words. Only deeds would kill his fear. And then he said, Mount up. Sitting with their blank grins in the ossuary niche by the wall of Honor were the 73 skulls of the men and women who had crewed Imperator Gladio before them, at least the ones they'd been able to find. Becherovka touched his hand to the oldest skulls, the bone blackened with age, silty with a crust of engine exhaust. He primed the terminal by the command seat and scanned the uploaded schematics. The multi-fuel engines were brewing hard, the reactor cooking up a full-throated growl that rattled his teeth. Jezek, already shirtless, his muscled chest as thick as a flak jacket, was sweating as he settled himself by the munitions sconce on the lower gunnery deck. Zaj and Musil checked in from the sponsons. Repairs had been hurried, and what was normally automated would require crude input. Polivo confirmed the power plant was turning over smoothly, or as well as could be expected. We have no tech priest, he voxed, no adept either. The network crackled, and his words were framed by a weird glissando. Becherovka squeezed the bud deeper into his ear, boosting the Vox suite on the command terminal. He glanced down the gangway from the gunnery deck to the engine room. Palivo raised a hand. "No," he confirmed. "Something went wrong. A neural burnout when he tried to interface last night. The machine spirit is truculent in this one." "So they say. Well, we'll make do," Palivo replied uneasily. "It's bad luck all the same." "There's no such thing as luck." "Yes, there is. This is a venerable machine we have the privilege to command, but let's not pretend it doesn't have its issues." Stein cheerily chipped in from the driver's cell. "How many times has it been recovered now?" 6, Becherovka said. "This is the 7th mission. This deployment." "My lucky number," she whooped as she gunned the engines. Then they all felt it, the implacable advance of the Gladio lurching forward. "At least we'll get to find out what really happened to the other guys." "That's enough," Becherovka said. He measured the shake out of his voice. "Look, I don't know any of you well, and some of you I don't know at all. But we all have a job to do, and I know we can do it. Trust in your guns, soldiers, and fear the Emperor's grace. Facta non verba." He looked through the viewing cupolas and saw the mist curl across clean air, the cobalt sky surrendering to the cloud. "Not water, not mud," he prayed. "Give me fire and thunder, but please, Emperor, don't let me die like that again." They moved for an hour, grinding steadily over the rough ground on the edge of the salt marshes, until they came to the first ridges of the switchbacks. Skirting them wide on the east flank, they entered the low foothills, where light from the twin suns dazzled in the golden grass, making the hidden meadows seem like great reflective plates of melted sand. Bars of mist rolled down from the switchbacks' higher peaks and settled in the troughs and valleys. Every few minutes the crew checked in, reporting sensor readings or cogitation data from the autoscribes in the rear hull. Becherovka moved from the main deck to the observation cupola in the turret, where he could sit in the secondary command chair. That feeling of enclosure, of being buried deep inside the tank, had been more than he could bear. At least here, with the primary hatch just above his head, it felt as if escape was only a moment away. The marshland beyond the switchbacks was a brooding morass, chill and drear. He tracked ghost signs on the auger screens, but they sputtered out into nothing when he switched to thermals. Although they were heading straight for it, the front seemed very far away. "Cold," Stein voxed after a while. "Anyone else notice it? Feels like we dropped 10 degrees here." Below, Jacek rummaged in his locker and pulled out his shirt. "Damn cold," he said. "Palivo, you hearing this?" Becherovka said. "Is there something wrong with the heating system?" The Vox sputtered and crackled. "Can any of you hear me? This throne damn thing," he muttered. There was a piercing shriek over the network, and all of them wrenched the looped Vox buds from their ears with a curse. Becherovka dropped his as if it were burning. Jacek's ear was bleeding, and Palivo shouted something unintelligible from the rear hull compartment. Becherovka climbed the short steps from the turret onto the gunnery deck and looked through the gangway. The engineer stood there, top half-framed in the hatchway, gesticulating over the Benebladis tetanic roar. The adamantium tracks squeled and groaned as they crushed their way over rock and earthalike. Becherovka checked the passive Auspex net, but nothing popped on the view screen. Just shades, ghosts, fluttered readings that smoothed out to nil. Where was the front? Where were all the things that by rights should be trying to kill them? "Jacek, how's the ear?" he bellowed down. Whether deafened by the vox burn or by the engine's unholy racket, the big man by the loading rack didn't notice. Becherovka crouched to tap him on the shoulder and switched to combat sign. "Load the rack," his fingers said. Jacek nodded. Through the hatchway, he waved to catch Palivo's attention and signed for half speed. Palivo nodded, but before he could do anything, the engines cut out, and Imperator Gladio lurched to a halt. "Palivo," he said, "talk to me. What's wrong?" "I don't know, sir. It's not responding. They just died on me." After the apocalyptic roar of the Super Heavy's motors, the sudden silence was absolute, unnerving, cathedral quiet. Becherovka looked back up to meet Kovar's eyes, and the gunner was mute. Jacek had frozen, crouched down by the munitions sconce. It was creeping closer, pressing itself to the back of his neck, squeezing his stomach tight. Panic, paralysis. "What do I do?" he thought. The words flashed in a looped relay through his mind, faster and faster. The water was lapping at his mouth, pooling over his frantic eyes. Water and mud, and the grasping hands of dead friends. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? "Sir?" Stein, calling from the driver's compartment. Her voice came muffled through the aperture. "Controls are dead here, Captain. What do I do?" Becherovka's attention snapped back. "Jacek," he said, "load the cannon." He tried to keep the tremble from his voice, but it made no difference, because right then the big man screamed, and the sound flashed like a blade through the silence. He looked down to see the loader on his back, scrambling away from the munitions sconce, desperately trying to kick the door closed. "There's something in there," Jacek shouted. "Something. Thrown. It looked at me," he retched. Becherovka felt adrenaline stab through his system. Kovar's face was a mask, and his hands were white-knuckled on the cannon's guiding rail. "Captain," Palivo shouted through the hatchway, "what the hell's going on in there?" "I don't know. It's... Jacek, come back to me. What did you see? What's in there?" Becherovka drew his last pistol. His hand was shaking again. The door to the munitions sconce creaked back slowly on its hinge, while Jacek flinched away from it. 6 feet of tanker, biceps practically as big as Becherovka's chest, and he looked like he was going to cry. Dropping down another level, Becherovka approached the locker and slowly pushed the door aside with the barrel of his pistol. "You see it?" Jacek whimpered. "What is it?" Becherovka lowered his gun, wiped the beaded sweat from his forehead. All he could see were the rows of shells for the Baneblade cannon, each tipped with the color of its function. Red for high explosive, green for armor piercing. "It's nothing," he said. "There's nothing there. I swear, Captain, I swear." And then it... No one said anything. Jacek couldn't meet his eye, and yet something had scared him bad. Becherovka glanced through at the ossuary niche, the stacked skulls brittle with age. What had they seen in their time? The silence inside the tank was almost unbearable. Some crewmen, lifers signed up for full service, lost their minds when they weren't on active duty. They needed the deep percussion of combat, of the super heavy crushing the land beneath its tracks, to feel even halfway whole. Becherovka wasn't one of them. That was his secret. Although 77th born and bred, he hated tanks. He hated the farmyard stink of soldiers locked in a small space for too long. He hated the feel of the walls closing in on him, the bleeding green light of low-sodium bulbs, the sour taste of recycled air. He hated it. He always had. And the walls were getting closer. 300 tons. 300 tons of storm sword, with a great rent in its side from the plasma cannon, lurching off the track and falling into the treacherous ground, belching air as it plummeted downwards, sucking in half the salt marshes. Water pouring like a tide over Hyobo and Daniver, their screams choked off, their eyes like black holes, the water lashing against his chest and forcing him like a cork in a bottle to the turret's jammed hatch. Emperor, save me. Emperor, protect me. Captain, the lieutenant said with quiet alarm. Kovar. What's that noise? It started low, a creeping scurry over the side of the tank. There was a soft tap on the top hatch, and then the sense of something pressing against it. A muffled giggle, a patter of feet. Silence. Becherovka had bitten his lip. He tasted blood. He still had the last pistol in his hand. Jezek looked at it uneasily, and then Becherovka realized he was pointing the gun straight at him. He lowered it slowly. It started again from the rear compartment, and even on the command deck they could hear it. The faint scrabbling against the outside power vents. Whispered voices through 3 feet of steel. He watched Palivo follow the sound with his eyes, tracing it from the ceiling of the engine deck to the corner of the exhaust housing. The engineer looked at him, eyes wide, frozen. Stein, Becherovka hissed. Stein. Yes, Captain. Her voice was thick with fear. Close the driver's hatch, he said. Seal us in. They were watching him, Kovar and Jezek, Palivo along the walkway. This was command, he thought. Make a decision, even if it's the wrong one. He climbed back up to the secondary command chair and checked the cupolas, cycling through thermal, ultraviolet, infrared, bare sight. The glass showed nothing. The land around them was pale with mistfall, bleak with drifting fume. There was no sound of gunfire, no artillery or cannon shot, no massed laser guns. The arch-enemy was silent. There was nothing. They were dead in the water. The outside of the tank looked deserted. The rustling, scurrying, tapping noise had stopped. Maybe whatever it was had given up. It couldn't crack this nut. It had moved on to easier, what, targets, prey. The silence rang in his ears. Silence had a presence of its own, he thought. It pushed at a man, challenged him, frayed his nerves. Becherovka gave one last look and dropped back down to the main deck. The engines, the power plant. That was the key. Get that up and running again, and the choices became clearer. Press on or go back. Palivo, he shouted through the hatchway. We need to vent the plant, or reroute the power, or whatever it is you grease monkeys do best. It stared at him from the other end of the gangway, and its mouth cracked into a grin. It looked like Palivo. It stood there like Palivo, and it had Palivo's face, but the eyes, they were black as the void, as black as deep, deep water. Becherovka snapped up the last pistol and emptied the power pack. The hiss-crack of blue beams ionizing the fetid air was loud as thunder. His vision was seared with it, but when he blinked his eyes clear, the hatchway was empty. There was a stench of ozone, and lying greasily atop it was the warm stink of cooked meat. Jezek and Kovar had both thrown themselves to the plate when the shooting started, and he could hear Stein shouting from the driver's compartment. Zaj and Musil were battering at the sponson hatches. Becherovka just stood there with his pistol extended, the barrel frosted with afterburn. Through the hatchway, along the short corridor to the engine deck, he could see a spark of flame from a wide shot that had hit the exhaust housing. "Fire!" he screamed, and as one the crew reacted. Every trainee crewman spent as much of his or her time on fire drills as they did on weapons training. A brewed-up tank with a sealed hatch was a crewman's nightmare, the story he told around the campfire to frighten new recruits. There was nothing more awful, everyone agreed. Everyone except Becherovka. Water. Water is worse than fire. Becherovka was first through the hatch, holstering his pistol. The thing that had been Polivo steamed and fizzled on the deck, its face a red mess of scorched meat, a steaming black crater where its chest had been. Drops of superheated blood had sprayed in a greasy tar across the chromium deck. Kovar, following the captain through the walkway, recoiled and fell back, spewing across the maintenance valves. Becherovka ignored him, popped the foam extinguisher from its bracket, and sprayed the flames. Mixed with dead meat, charred skin, and chemicals was the tangy stink of burnt plastic from the wire housings. Kovar wiped vomit from his mouth and lunged at the captain, trying to wrestle the pistol from Becherovka's holster. Jacek stooped low and clambered into the engine deck, and Becherovka could hear Zaj and Musil trying to batter their way out of the sponson chambers. "You shot him! You shot him!" Kovar was screaming. "What is wrong with you? Are you insane?" "You didn't see it. It wasn't Polivo. It was something else, I swear it. It was in here with us. You didn't see its eyes." The lieutenant had tight hold of the pistol's handle, and Becherovka couldn't prise his fingers loose. He let go suddenly, and Kovar stumbled backwards with the last pistol in an awkward grip. Before he could bring it up to fire, Becherovka knocked it from his hand. He snapped out his forearm to lightly cuff Kovar's throat, and then the soldier was down, spluttering, fighting for breath. Jacek just stood there, dumbfounded. Becherovka scooped up the gun and reloaded. "I'm telling you, that wasn't Polivo," he said evenly. "Look at it, Kovar. Look at it." He pointed the pistol at the body. Zaj and Musil were still pounding at their hatches, their voices muffled behind the steel. "How can you tell?" Kovar croaked. "You look at him. You shot him in cold blood, and you attacked a senior officer in a combat zone." He pointed the pistol at him. "That's a capital offense, Lieutenant. A battlefield execution." Kovar looked up at him from his knees, fire in his eyes. "It's true what they say about you, Captain. You've lost your mind. You died down there in the swamp, and you never came back." The mud and filth, the stagnant water creeping higher and higher, a tide line that reached his chin and spilled into his mouth. He stretched his neck, toes just barely reaching the turret steps, pressing his face into the shrinking pocket of air. 4 days. 4 days in the rancid dark. Bobbing below him, the dead bodies of his crew. Becherovka pressed the barrel of the last pistol to Kovar's forehead. "I did come back," he whispered. "I'm right here." They stood like that for what felt like hours. Becherovka with his gun against the lieutenant's head. Jacek frozen beside him, the thing that had been Polivo still steaming on the plate at their feet. It grinned, and it looked at me. Thrown. What was it? What is going on? Jezek, he said. Sir, let Zaj and Musil out. But it was only then that Bekirovka realized they'd stopped hammering. He looked up and saw why. Saw the ropes of blood dribbling through the gaps beneath the doors. And before he could say anything, the slaved servo skull above the autoscribes started snapping its jaw. The sphygmograph pens rattled in their casings. The parchment rolls started to unfurl, and the pens were scribbling madly on the paper. Cogitation data, Becherovka thought. The Gladio's machine spirit, finally telling us what's going on. What does it say? He said to Jezek. Kovar was still on his knees. Read it. What does it say? The loader turned back from the cogitation bench. His face was white. He looked grief-stricken, defeated. It says, murder. The servo skull cackled at them. The lights across the engine deck flickered and dimmed, and then shut down completely. The scurrying tapping noise was back, only this time it was in there with them, mere feet away, snuffling and slobbering. Get into the front hull, Becherovka ordered. Jezek, moving fast for a big man, dived through the hatch and clambered into the command deck. Becherovka snapped off 2 shots with the Les Pistol, and then followed him, and in the strobed glare of the beams, he thought he saw something unfurling from the darkness, drear and hungry, and infinitely cold. Kovar, move yourself. It's almost on you. But Kovar was too slow. He rose from his knees and pulled himself up into the hatchway, but then Becherovka looked back to see him hauled bodily out. His eyes went wide, glassy with fright, mouth stretched to frame a scream that never came. The darkness swallowed him, like a stone dropped into deep water. Deep water, he thought. Deep, deep water, stinking of death. Stain, he cried. Abandon the tank, get out, save yourself. Jezek had scrambled up into the turret, and he was weeping as he tried to unscrew the hatch lock. The muscles popped out on his arms, and sweat streamed down his face, but it wouldn't budge. Just let me out, please, please, please let me out, he whimpered. Through the hatch, the blackness unfurled, pouring like ink, dripping down from the gangway, down to the munitions floor, up to the base of the turret steps. Jezek saw it and screamed, beating the steel now, as if he could break his way out with his fists alone. The darkness dripped across his feet, and he tried to curl up away from it. An absurd sight, Becherovka thought. Such a big man, curled up like a child on the command chair. He almost laughed. Then he saw the skulls in the ossuary niche, each looking down at him with black eyes, goat's eyes, the slotted pupils, dancing with black light. Becherovka feared his gun until the power pack was dead, until the ripples of darkness had smothered the steps and drawn Jezek down into them, uncomplaining, a look on his face, almost like peace. Underneath the feed tray for the autocannon was a collection receptacle for the spent casings, and in a niche beside it was a narrow aperture that led into the driver's deck. He scrambled through, barking his shins on the metal. Stein, I said to get out for thrones. Her severed hands were still holding the escape hatch's handle. Becherovka dropped down into the rest of her. There is no way out. There is only a pocket of air, shrinking and growing staler and staler. He moved back through to the command deck, but the darkness had swallowed it. The red bulbs of the gangway lamps flickered in their cages, strobing the chamber. Becherovka scurried past the shadow's edge and rolled down into the munition store, past the sconce and its creaking door, past the sighing breath of whatever was hiding in there, the glistening eye. On the darkness flowed, slopping into the corrugated channels of the chromium plate floor. Almost, almost, almost. He cracked down the breech lever on the demolisher cannon, skipped back as the recoil mechanism cranked to the side, and the breech swung open on its reinforced hinge. The great socket mount yawned to admit him. Peering into it, Becherovka could see a ring of sunlight at the other end, bright and clear. He pulled himself in and shinnied up the tube, the barrel's rifled interior twisting at his fatigues, gritty and constricted, wreathed in the rotten egg smell of burnt cordite. But it was going to work. It was actually going to work. His arms were squeezed into his side, and his shoulders felt like they were both going to dislocate at once. But if he pressed in with his feet and his elbows, he could wriggle up an inch at a time, agonizingly slowly, infinitely painful. But it was going to work. Nearly there, he muttered, grinning at the light above him. Please, Emperor, please shine your grace on your faithful servant, and let me live. The barrel pressed in on him, ever closer, oily and black. He had scraped his forehead against the rifling, and blood ran freely down his face. He tried to move his arms, but they were stuck fast. The muscles in his shoulders screamed with the effort of crawling up another inch, another half-inch. Cramps rippled in his calves. His eyes were blinded by blood and sweat. The walls closed in. The hollow chamber squeezed him, jamming into his back, his knees. He couldn't breathe. If he held up his head, a chain of fire burned down his spine. But if he rested his chin on the barrel, his chest was too constricted to draw a breath. He sipped shallow little gasps of air, and he knew, as if sitting outside of himself, that he was starting to panic. He wanted to thrash his arms and legs and scream, but he couldn't move. The black tunnel was squeezing him tighter and tighter, and his breath was dying in his lungs. The roar of madness was in his ears. The water was getting higher and higher, and all light was gone. He could feel it lapping at his ankles, like ice, rising up to freeze his legs and grip his chest in its stagnant embrace. And then the water was surging up the barrel, rising, encircling his neck, a brackish ring that crawled higher and higher, feathering against his chin, his mouth, his nose. He was stretched out on the very edge of sanity, and he was gulping to reach the disk of air that lay just above his face. And he was in the storm sword drifting down, the salt marshes swallowing it up like a stone dropped into deep water. Fire and thunder, he thought. He tried to laugh, but his laughter disappeared in a bubble of air. A recon crew found Imperator Gladio 4 days later, high in the switchbacks. The front had rolled on, the enemy advance grinding to a halt in the face of the 77th's implacable defense. The Baneblade was untouched by enemy fire. It lay dormant in the earth. The great adamantium tracks clogged with mud, the armor plating dusted with fine silt. Its silent cannon pointed towards the distant fighting. There was no sign of the crew. Deserters, some said. Decent men led astray by a bad command. Captain Becherovka had always been a weak link in the chain, ever since that incident with the storm sword. It took 2 Atlas recovery tanks to haul it down off the ridge, and a week of concerted prayer to get it running again. In the motor pool, tech priests and mechanics ministered to it body and soul, and before long, the Dragoons had one of their most powerful assets restored to them. A crew was always difficult to find, but the regimental officers moved quickly to scotch any rumors. The Gladio was a venerable machine, Colonel Radetzky said, much storied, a veteran of 1,000 campaigns. Who wouldn't want the honor of crewing such a vessel in the Emperor's name? Indeed, the Lord Commissar agreed. There were 80 skulls in the ossuary niche. Just think, one day yours could be there too.